All right. It's recording, supposedly. Does it look like it?
I don't think we've met, Graham, or have we?
Hi.
Hi.
Jamala Henderson. I recognize your name. You work with KUOW, is that right?
I used to.
Used to.
Yeah.
Very good to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Yeah. Worked on the project on family homelessness for several years with Catherine almost 10 years ago now. 9 years ago, 8 years ago.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. That's a long time.
Yeah.
It's a problem that still exists.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So Graham has done a ton of research on vehicle residency, Jamala. So
oh, really?
Probably any work that you've seen that deals with it in this region, he had some part in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, actually, I helped to develop the the system that they use to count vehicles in King County, and ran the count for the last 3 or 4 years. Helped to do that, and
Is
now
that
heading off
something-
to UCSF to do research down there.
Oh, cool. Is that something that gets added into the annual yearly count?
It's part of the count, and so it's part of. If you ever read the report, it's if you the big old report they put out every year. There's a special population subcount section. It's got like veterans and families and children, youth, and young adults, and then vehicle residents is part of it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, Anna.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thank you.
Good. Yay. Happy Monday, everyone.
Yes, thank you. You too. Okay, so
Hi,
I think
Anna, I haven't met you. My name's Jamala.
Hey, how are you doing, Jamala?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Your background makes me like long for a pretty day or something.
That's Lake Quinault.
oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, David.
Hello. How are you, Catherine?
Good. How are you? Welcome.
I am well.
Hi, David.
Nice
I'm
to see you.
Jamala.
Hey, Jamala. Nice to meet you virtually.
Nice to meet you too.
Hi, David. It's been a long time.
Hey, Graham. How are you?
Great. Good to see you again.
Hey,
Good to
David.
see you.
Oh, and Dean Powers too.
Powers, yeah. Hi.
Hey, everybody.
Hi. So we're expecting about 25 people,
Oh,
Great.
and including our speakers. So we'll wait a minute or
Your
two.
last day.
Sorry?
When is your last day?
August 31st.
Wow. Been a great run.
Yeah.
outstanding,
Thank
Ron.
you.
Outstanding.
Thank you. Let's see, David Bly just joined us. Hi, David.
Good to see you, Dean Powers. It's been a bit.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Graham. Yeah, I was just looking at the residency, the vehicle residency thing. I think if I remember, you were involved in that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and actually, I was just talking to Catherine. I just accepted a postdoc position at UCSF with the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative, leading up further research around vehicle residency.
Fantastic.
So we're gonna approach it at even a national perspective. So taking the work that we built on it actually here at Seattle U and taking it actually to a much larger national level.
That's great. That's great.
It's very exciting.
Thank you for all your support. Seriously, for these years, it was you made it happen. You all of you did. Yeah, really.
Hi, everybody who's joined us in the last minute or two. Sarah and Daniel, Lindy, and Annika and Mary Ann. I see Sydney. Hi.
Hi.
And Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie.
It always kind of feels like
Valerie, Emily. Lisa. Sorry, was that you, Graham?
yeah, I was trying to think, what was that show? Romper Room with the magic mirror. It's the birthday I see.
That's what Zoom is, huh?
That's right. Yeah.
I actually remember that show.
Yeah.
Hey, Graham. Hey, Catherine.
Hello. How are you?
See you.
You know, living the dream. Living the dream.
Hey, Lindy.
Lindy?
Hey, Zach.
Hello. Lisa, what is the dream, though? That's really what we need to know. Because I feel like your dream might be better than my dream right now.
I do have the ability to always put the good spin on it, right? Oh, Lord. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In someone's dream.
Yeah, someone's dream. I think 2020 is like an LSD fever dream of somebody, and we're just in a really bad matrix right now.
Right, yeah.
That's my hope.
Oh.
Hunter Thompson's last gasp.
Right. I heard Elon Musk said that, if this is a simulation, then the real world has to be pretty boring because, we only play games that are really interesting, right? If this is the game, and this is interesting, then the real world must be really boring.
Okay, I see Scott and I see Erica joining us, so I think we'll be ready to start.
Yeah, it looks like we've got everybody.
Yay. And we'll have other people joining along the way. I think Colin is going to be calling in from his trip back east. Rainey might be joining us. So there's Eric. And Emma should be hopping on too. So this is fantastic. Anna, did you make Erica, Scott, and Sydney co-hosts already?
No, I have not done that yet, Catherine.
Okay.
If you want to do that.
Okay. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, sure. If it's easy for you, I don't know if I've mastered Zoom yet to do it in a second, but yeah. If you don't mind, Catherine.
Okay. So I'm just looking now for Erica. While I'm fumbling around, I'm going to say welcome to everybody. We're delighted you could be here. This is the very last time we'll have a chance to get together in this iteration, the Project on Family Homelessness. We've been doing this since, fall of 2013. We would get together 3 or 4 times a year to find out what everybody was doing and figure out how we could collaborate. So when we were writing this final grant, which is ending on August 31st, one of the things that I wrote into it was to have some kind of event where we were able to look back at how coverage of homelessness has changed since 2010 when we started out. So I am super excited to have not only a lot of our partners and former partners with us, but the team from the Seattle Times, including Erica Schultz, who was a member of the very first Journalism Fellows team from the Seattle Times, Scott Greenstone and Sydney Brownstone, and Anna Patrick from Project Homeless. So thank you all for being here. It's fantastic, and I can't wait to hear what our friends from the Seattle Times have to say. I want to make sure that I've covered all my notes. I think I did. The agenda is in the chat. I'm going to just quickly talk about the journalism fellowships for those who aren't familiar with it, and I'm trying to advance my slides and they're not advancing. Graham, I have not mastered this yet. In 2009, Seattle University was awarded a grant from the Gates Foundation to host a program on journalism, a journalism fellowship program, because, and I'm sure Colin and David can elaborate on this, they were realizing that there just wasn't very much coverage of family homelessness in media. And the idea was if we could establish this journalism fellowship program where we'd invite professional journalists to come and study family homelessness very specifically and in depth, and give them financial support to do that, they could then go out and do research and pursue their own projects. And one of the amazing things was the way that they were able to come together and collaborate among themselves. We had that first year 6 different news organizations participating. And the second year we expanded it to 2 organizations in Pierce and Snohomish counties. And about 10 years ago this month, something really substantial and significant happened in the Journalism Fellowship Program. And I'm not going to spoil it because I think Erica's probably going to talk about it. So I am going to turn it over to Erica. And if I ever do get my slides figured out, then I will share them later. So Erica, why don't we turn it over to you? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us today to talk about some of the work that we've done in the past. I'm going to share my screen real quick.
And I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
And while Erica's sharing, just a brief, maybe second introduction. Erica Schultz is a staff photographer here at the Seattle Times. She is an award-winning journalist, and she has been at the Times covering homelessness for a long while. So we thought too, as we kind of take this time to sort of celebrate the work of Seattle U and the Project on Family Homelessness, why not start from where this collaboration first began?
Great. Excellent. Are you able to see this yet?
Right now we're seeing, now.
Now, does that work?
Yeah, it worked.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Sorry about that. So I feel really lucky to have participated in the fellowship in 2010. I was on a team with then Seattle Times reporter Lornette Turnbull and our engagement editor Nina Pardo, and we were one of 6 news organizations that participated in the fellowship with 8 SU students. And speaking as a photographer and as a videographer, I don't specifically have a beat. We cover a lot of different assignments every single week, and so for this fellowship really helped me understand the issues around family homelessness, from the lack of affordable housing to childcare to how 211 worked at the time. And so during the spring of, I'm going to get to the next slide. Sorry about that. So during the spring of 2010, we started to reach out to community members, to organizations, to try to reach out to connect with families. And it takes a long time to be able to I guess, create trust with a lot of different organizations, with families. And so we really wanted to look at family homelessness through a variety of lenses, and we really wanted them to be rooted in community members' personal stories. So we followed Cherie Moore and her son Cody, who is 17. They lived together in their truck with all their belongings for 3 weeks in South King County. We wanted to look at it through a variety of lenses, so we spent quite a bit of time with Cherie and with Cody. We also worked on issues involving recently resettled refugee families. We also touched base with single fathers and their families' issues with accessing especially housing services. We also worked with families navigating hotel vouchers. And we partnered with local blogs and news outlets to try to get more hyper-local stories as well. So in this presentation, I was going to show you a little bit of background about working with one family in particular. When starting on Visible Families, it took a lot of phone calls and meetings. Eventually, I think the most important thing is trying to find families who really want to share their stories. And I had met Kim and Jack Ahern while they were living at Nicholsville in Skyway. And Kim had just moved to the Northwest, and she was looking for secretarial work. The hotel vouchers that she was promised had fallen through, and she was working at the security desk when I had met her. And when thinking about participation in the project, we talked about a lot of different factors. We talked about, what was the project, what were my motivations. Dealing with housing insecurity can be extremely stressful. So it was asking, does she have the bandwidth to participate? Do you have the bandwidth to keep in touch over several weeks? Do you have enough resources to keep in touch by phone? So we also walked through a lot of different scenarios, especially working with Jack. We talked about, would Jack feel comfortable if he went to school and his friends knew about their situation? Would he feel comfortable with that later in life? Would it be okay to publish this story if Kim was still looking for a job? And so we try to share, Kim in the end, she thought about it for a while and she decided it was important to share, how difficult it was to navigate through social services while being unhoused. We also talked about, what was really important to share in their story. Was it showing Jack's bedtime rituals? Was it showing like how difficult it is to cook and to feed a child without running water? Was it the difficulty of like going and commuting downtown to access services? And so I think it was really important to show that their story was about housing, but it was also about like family bonds and the wonder of childhood. Jack was really imaginative and gregarious and funny. He loved scary stories and Goosebumps books. And simple tasks were really hard for them. They would need to walk a mile from Skyway to the Tukwility Community Center for showers. And as a journalist, I really struggled at that time because I had a car and I could like easily take them. But it was important, I think, for me to walk with them during that process and to show, how difficult it is to be able to access services. So off and on during a couple of weeks, I kept in touch with Kim. I would touch base with her through the Nicholsville phone. And because we had so many conversations before the camera came out, I felt like the family felt comfortable with me, and I would ask permission along the way to photograph them, as Jack went to bed. They both seemed open and unguarded. So I think anytime that like there are like those indications where, there are sensitivities along the way, we always like ask permission, touch base. We're constantly making sure that the situation feels okay with everybody involved. So I think this is over at the Urban Rest Stop. A lot of times they want to show like sense of place, but we also like there's a lot that's involved with getting permissions to photograph at the Urban Rest Stop and at different social service providers and making sure that, the man behind Kim and Jack felt comfortable also being, in the frame of the photograph. So there's more of a story that's available online, but, I just wanted to share a little bit of their story, a little bit of like when we are able to connect with community members and they're really motivated to share their stories. And we're able to get the time and the resources to be able to really walk with them in their lives. I don't think this project would have been available, or I don't think it would have been even possible without having that dedicated time of the fellowship and also having all the resources available and all of the background information to be able to understand, the different complexities when it came to family homelessness. You can feel free to any questions. I think that's what I have so far.
Does anybody have a question for Erica specifically? We'll have some time for a Q&A later. Do you want to wait until we hear the rest? We can do that. Erica, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your project was incredible. It started publishing, I think, on August 30th, 2010. So just about 10 years ago this month. Really incredible depth and breadth and the amount of storytelling that you did. There had never been anything like it in the country. I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you to our funders from the Gates Foundation, since Colin is going to need to leave partway through. We're really honored that we could be joined by Colin Min, David Wertheimer, now retired from the Gates Foundation, and David Bly. So thank you all for being here and for funding this work. Anna, are we ready for Scott now?
Yeah, so as we were thinking today about what to share with you all, we wanted to look at the history, right, of the fellowship, but also to take a moment when we think about coverage of homelessness, take a moment to look at how Project Homeless, the team at the Seattle Times, came to be. This is a very unique team in the country. 3 people are solely dedicated to covering homelessness. And as far as I believe we're aware, this is the first of its kind to have something with such dedication to one issue. So we have Scott Greenstone. He is a reporter on the Project Homeless team, and he's actually the last original member of the Project Homeless team, still with us today. So so I've asked Scott if he could kind of walk us back in time a little bit to talk about those early days and how the team has changed and evolved with time. So Scott, you should be able to share your screen if you need to. Let us know if you need anything.
Is it coming through now?
Yeah, it's working.
Great. Okay.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be here. We've done a lot of work together. I've partnered with Catherine several times on different events throughout the years, and it's always been such an incredible experience. So before I say anything about, I should say that Catherine, I'm really sorry to see this. I'm going to be sad not to continue working with you in this capacity. You've done some incredible work, and the events that we've put on with your organization have just been so fulfilling. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them. But without partnering with you, they would not have happened, and there would have been so much. There was so much value added from your project. So thanks for having us to talk today. In 2017, I was hired to be the engagement editor on this Project Homeless effort that I didn't know much about at the time, and my job was to essentially try and answer. Essentially, we were dealing with this issue where, because we hadn't covered homelessness very thoroughly in the past, what we felt we had was a reading public that wasn't very educated about homelessness, about its drivers, about who homeless folks were, and about the systems. And at the same time, we also there's not a lot of public knowledge. I mean, the diving into the roots of homelessness has really been an effort undertaken in public policy in the last, I would say, at least on a deep level, in the last 5 to 10 years. So there's still a lot, I think, that is debated about some root causes of homelessness. I won't obviously say that there's much debated about the recent rise. We know that that's because of affordable housing, but there are, of course, a lot of nitty-gritty issues, mental health, substance use, things like that we really had to try and dig into and explain to people in a way where we felt like they would be able to understand it. So this was our first story up on the screen here. It was written by Vernal Coleman, and it published October 26, 2017. It was an announcement of this new project, but it was also an investigation into the relatively small group of chronically homeless folks who were staying in Seattle's homeless shelters and had been there sometimes for years and years without sort of moving on into housing. And I remember when this story published, I don't think I realized at the time how important it was to sort of explain. People group homeless folks into, they essentially see, and I think we've all experienced this, folks who live in their vehicles, folks who live in tent camps, folks who live downtown in shelters, they sort of all group them into this one category. So when we said at the time there were close to 11,000 homeless folks by the point in time count, when we said 11,000, people thought 11,000 chronically homeless people in Seattle, and of course we all know, or in King County, and of course we all know that that is not the case. So we also, Viana, this was one of Viana's early stories, digging into the navigation team, which at the time was fairly new, and is probably currently in the process of being defunded and dismantled by the Seattle City Council, but kind of crazy to look back at that. This was in November of 2017 that Viana published this. And this was one of my first stories. And I remember that at this time we were just trying to kind of lay groundwork. So there were some small towns near Seattle had been cracking down on folks asking for money. And Jonathan gave me the assignment to, let's write about that, but let's also just, why don't you just take this as an opportunity to ask a bunch of homeless advocates in Seattle and the surrounding area, pastors, activists, real change sellers, but, you know, do you give to homeless people? Should you, what's that ethical question? So kind of laying the groundwork on a very simple question, but that is also a question that is probably the most common one that the average person gets asked when every day. Like, if you don't interact with homelessness policy, what's your interaction with homeless folks day to day? It's probably someone asking you for money. If you're around downtown Seattle. So we really wanted to take this sort of pedestrian approach where we could try and bring in and engage people who might not care about homelessness otherwise. We wrote a little bit about, this was about GoFundMe. This is one of my early stories as well. And just, again, trying it does contributing to that GoFundMe help folks, and in some cases it does, and in some cases, you know, there have been documented cases where it didn't. And we also just kind of tried to reach out into the community as well and said, you know, hey, come have coffee with us. This was not the first event. I couldn't find the first event, but we had the first one was in early 2018, soon after we launched. And just kind of invited whoever to come in and ask us questions. And we got some cranky people. We got some folks that came with, you know, genuine things that they just didn't understand. And we, speaking with people in the community, it really became obvious that there was still this sort of, there was definitely this desire to engage with and an agreement around many of the key issues, even though, you know, to some people they would disagree with housing first. If in theory, if they would also agree that maybe if that housing came with the options for treatment for people who wanted it and for mental health, for substance use treatment and mental health services, that they would say, oh, well, I guess, you know, but a lot of people just didn't know what existed and didn't know that that was part of the housing first model. And this, of course, we worked with Seattle University, or with Catherine and you know, to put on 2 of these events. The first one was called Ignite Project Homeless because we used that Ignite. The Ignite format is a 5-minute talk with 20 slides, and we used that and had folks who were formerly homeless or had very close interactions or had worked heavily in this field to tell their stories. And we did 2 of these events. We didn't end up doing this one this year because of COVID. But we put on these events because we also realized that besides people not fully understanding the mechanics and the root causes, there was also, you know, and I think a failure to grasp the variety of types of folks and reasons for people ending up in homelessness. We had at this first event someone who ended up in homelessness because of medical debt, because of traumatic brain injuries, because of a whole host of reasons. And when they stood up on the stage and told their stories in their own words, um, I think that those videos are still online. You can go and watch them if you search Ignite Project Homeless, or last year the event was called Stories About Home. That when it's laid out for you in someone's own words, there was so much power behind that. And at the same time, the people who are going to come and sit down and listen to 8 to 10 stories of folks who are experiencing homelessness are often folks who are choosing to let themselves into that space of empathy, which was, something that we identified kind of right who already worked in homeless services. Not that that was a problem, but just we saw this kind of thing, this continuing trend of where people who were frustrated with homelessness would interact with our stories about certain incidents with news and media that had to do with fires and homeless camps and things like that. And people with more empathy, or people who, I shouldn't say with more empathy, but people who were sort of, there were other people interacting with our stories that open up, that really engage with people on the ground. So what we tried to do often was bring more of those personal stories into and more of that, try engage more with that empathy in the stories about policing, in the stories about policy. And I think one of the best examples, and I actually didn't put this story in there, but was Viana's story about the Vital program, where she profiled last year someone who had been through this system several times and had been arrested again and again, and had also been, a lot of businesses were very frustrated with her, but it went into her story and talked about a treatment that worked for her, and that was an approach that we took. We also just tried to engage with the people who were frustrated in a way that kind of tried to draw them in with headlines like these, and then kind of say, many of the people in Seattle are from here, especially from Washington, but also, why do people move? Why do people travel? Is it because there aren't services where they are? Is it because there isn't anything from drug treatment to mental health services to whatever? Like, this is a very complicated picture. So we would try to draw folks in with these explainer articles, and then try to kind of click in this sort of, hey, this is a little bit more complicated than, oh, everyone's coming to Seattle because, we give away a bunch of free stuff. And we also dug into some of these places that these areas where spotlight had not been shown. We had written very little about RVs, folks living in vehicles, and this was a story about Viana just from last year also, so a little bit further along in the project, to live in an RV in Seattle. And I think that it's hard to say how much of this has really had an effect on the greater discourse, but I would say that just looking back 3 years ago at how much of the conversation was about chronic homelessness and the frustration, and this side says one thing and this side says another, the businesses say this, the advocates say this, I think that we've seen at least some coming together on some key issues. I think the Third Door Coalition that Sarah Rankin and many other organizations, including I think the Project on Family Homelessness, has been able to find some there's more common ground, I think, found between groups like the business community and advocates than there were 3 years ago. And I think that also we've seen since COVID that the change in approaches and some of the openness about how things like shelters, our very first story was a focus on these people who had been in shelters for a long time and were very sick. There's a lot more discussion about how awful shelters are for people living outside. So I do think that there's been a change in coverage and the public discussion around homelessness in the last 3 years. It can be sometimes hard to nail down, but I think there's more of bipartisan agreement, not bipartisan agreement, but there's more agreement across the board that sometimes policing and the ways police respond to homelessness. I think I bring up the navigation team defunding just because that first vote to just remove SPD, to remove police officers from the team, was a unanimous vote across from Alex Peterson, who I think a lot of folks would see as maybe not. I think that for him to vote to remove police from that team demonstrated to me that more folks are sort of saying, you know what, policing might not be the answer sometimes to getting folks off the street. So I think that has shifted, that kind of understanding has shifted. But I think moving forward, we're also going to be looking at, these first 3 years we looked at the navigation team, we looked at neighborhood issues. I think moving forward, one of the issues we'll be looking at is governance around the Regional Homelessness Authority. We've already written some about this. And I think that we'll also be trying to focus more on these systems and how do these systems fail people. Because I think we know that, but we don't have as many examples in our coverage because they can be hard to find. And so I think, yeah, that's how the project has sort of shifted and changed over time. And if anyone has any questions, that was all I prepared.
I think, Scott, thank you so much. That was really informative. And I think I'd like to have our panel follow up on questions so that we can stay on our schedule. That's okay. Thank you very much. Anna, I think we're ready for Sydney now.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Scott. And I just wanted to mention, so Scott mentioned 2 live events, storytelling events that we held in partnership with Catherine and Seattle U. I went ahead and dropped those links into the chat. So if you're interested, check them out. And now we're joined with Sydney Brownstone. She's a reporter on the Project Homeless team. And Catherine and I were talking, I think often you might see a story come out, but there's a lot of work and thought that goes into making these happen. And in the crazy time that is COVID, right, where there's a lot of things happening in our world right now simultaneously, we thought it would be great to take just like a deeper behind the scenes look at how a recent story, came to life. So with that, I will share my screen and I will stop talking, Sydney, so that you can, go ahead and take, give me 1 minute. Do I need permission? Oh no, I think I've got it. Okay. Okay, all yours, Sydney.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, I do not have as amazing visuals as Erica did, but this story came out fairly recently. It was about what's going on with coordinated entry during COVID, and specifically what's going on with housing referrals by race. So the way I kind of clued into this story was I was doing that thing that beat reporters often do is, we have a question and then we just start clicking around seeing if we can find an answer to it. So my question was, what the hell is going on with housing during COVID-19? Are people actually getting housed? There's kind of this choke point at shelters. A lot of people aren't able to get into shelters. What does it look like on the other side? So I started listening to All Homes Coordinated Entry Policy Advisory Council meetings, which is quite a mouthful. But when I started listening to those meetings, I realized there was a really intense debate happening about something called external fills. And that sounds so jargony and so complicated, but I was like, external fills, I've never even heard that term before. I got to figure out what that is. And what they were discussing on these calls was the fact that basically during COVID, they decided we really need to speed up this housing process because people are more vulnerable than ever. So we need to find a way to get them into housing ASAP. And what they were originally doing is, people they take an assessment to measure how vulnerable they are. And the people with the highest vulnerability scores get placed in something called a priority pool. And then when units come along, the county picks people from the priority pool and tries to match them with housing. Oftentimes what happens though is that housing, that unit isn't really appropriate for a lot of people in the priority pool. Either the housing provider rejects the person in the priority pool, the person in the priority pool rejects the housing, or maybe just the housing isn't the right fit. You know, maybe someone in the priority pool really needs permanent supportive housing, but the unit that's available is like a rapid rehousing unit. So something where someone gets help moving in, but basically it's hands off after that. So what happened is I started listening, and I decided, okay, I really need to talk to people having these meetings, having this debate, because what was happening was instead of the usual process of going through this evaluation and then having 2 case conferencing sessions to decide how people get matched to housing, is they decided to shorten that process. And if they couldn't quickly find someone to match into housing, what they were doing is saying to the housing providers, you just pick people you know from the community. You know, you guys have a sense of who needs what. We trust you to do this to keep the process moving. And weirdly, what was happening is that more Black people were getting housing this way. So for years and years, the county has tried to make its intake coordinated entry process more racially equitable, because studies have found that white people are usually found to be the most vulnerable. And there's a lot of guesses and research as to why. One piece of research has suggested that, you know, the intake assessments that we have just don't measure vulnerabilities experienced by people of color very often very well. So if you're only looking at substance use, mental health issues in like narrow kind of questions, you might end up with a bunch of white people. So this was eye-opening to me, because this was basically showing that when we actually broke some of the system down, it was helping the county meet some of its racial equity benchmarks. Of course, it's a more complicated story because it's not working as well for other groups. It's definitely not working as well for Latinx, Hispanic folks, and it's not working as well for Native American folks, but the jury's kind of still out on the data. But anyway, like, my job as a reporter is to communicate this to an audience. So here is something that is incredibly complicated, coordinated entry. You could major in it in college, and you might not still fully understand everything by the time you come out. And I was wondering, how do I tell this incredibly complex story about systems and data and race to a general audience? And I had a lot of conversations with Janice Hardy at the YWCA, and I just said, you know, do you know anyone who was waiting a while for housing but scored low on the tool and then got housed through external fill? And she said, yeah, I do actually. I'm pretty sure my case managers know someone like that. And that's how I met Giovanni. And, you know, I didn't really have an idea on how to tell this story until I met Giovanni. And I like to think that I let her tell the story just with me as kind of the typer, the intermediary with extra context, because something that struck me about Giovanni, she was fleeing domestic violence. She had 2 kids. She came to Seattle with nothing but some backpacks for her and the kids. She went into this shelter. She had also, you know, in years past, she'd been dealing with housing instability already. She'd been bouncing around family and friends' couches. And she had also dealt with economic instability. She had been doing sex work at times to make ends meet. So, you know, you would think that someone fleeing domestic violence who maybe has gaps on their resume and a history of doing sex work might be considered vulnerable enough to get housing in King County. But she wasn't. She scored low, and she stayed in a shelter for about 5.5 months until a case manager from the YWCA came to her and said, you know, we've got a unit. Do you think this works for you? And so she was one of the people housed under this external fills policy. The really interesting thing about talking to Giovanni was her resilience. The whole conversation was just about the choices that she made and what her goals were. And it really, one thing that I really wanted to communicate or let Giovanni communicate is, even though so much of this beat is about systems and oppression and vulnerability, it's also about resilience and strength of individuals navigating these systems. And that's what really stood out to me about Giovanni. That came up in a conversation we just had about human trafficking, for example. So her case manager told me that she was a victim of human trafficking. And when I was having a conversation with her, I said, how do you want that to be referred to in print? Is it human trafficking? Is it sex work? And she was very clear with me. She said, I don't think I'm a human trafficking victim. I think I'm a survivor of sex work. And when she told me her story of sex work, it was actually way more nuanced than just like human trafficking would have you believe, or even sex work would have you believe. Part of the time she worked independently, but sometimes she had management. Sometimes it was something that she felt good doing, and a lot of the times it was something that she didn't feel great doing. So I really hope that with Project Homeless going forward, we're able to tell more of those individual stories that not only show these major systemic issues, but also get into the nuances of personal stories, because I think that there is a tendency, and oftentimes it's motivated by good intentions, to kind of reduce someone to a sob story and make them really two-dimensional. And Giovanni was anything but that. And at the same time, she, her story was indicative of like this bigger systemic issue. So it was the story of Giovanni, but it was also the story of what it's like as a Black woman to sit down to take a test to measure how vulnerable she is. After all this time, she's been trying to demonstrate how resilient she is and how strong she is and how she can take care of her kids, It's really no wonder she got a low score if you walk into that thinking, I don't want to be a stereotype. And that's how Giovanni walked into the test and took it. And to me, it just showed how incompatible some of our systems are with people's individual experiences. So, that was the reporting. That was kind of the theme of the writing, just kind of standing back and trying to let Giovanni's story be the vehicle for this larger story as much as I possibly could. I'll give you just some insight into some of the conversations I had with my editors. One of the things that came up late in the editing process was actually about Giovanni's history with sex work. My one editor asked, should we even include this in the piece? Giovanni had expressed a fear of having CPS take her kids away if she answered in the affirmative on the vulnerability evaluation about mental health issues, or anything like that. She didn't want to be seen as quote unquote crazy, and she didn't want people to fear that she wasn't able to take care of her kids. And so one of the questions I was asked was, would her history as a sex worker, could that launch a CPS investigation or something like that? And the short story is that CPS, not necessarily, and also this is something in her past. And my impulse is always to try and leave that up to the person I'm telling the story about, like how much they're comfortable sharing in the piece. And Giovanni was very clear, I want that to be part of my story because it is part of my story. I'm not trying to hide anything, and I want people to learn from what I've experienced. And, it's really rare that we're able to, as journalists, meet people who want to tell their stories so like this and put everything out there. So I felt really fortunate to be able to meet Giovanni in the first place, and that, she wanted to tell her story to a larger audience. We ended up including that in the piece because I think it also spoke to the economic conditions that she was experiencing and some of the tough choices that she had to make. But this was published, and I was worried that people weren't going to understand it because it was about coordinated entry. But I think the fact I got some nice emails, and I think the fact that people did understand it is a testament to just Giovanni's story and kind of going through the system with her in the piece. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sydney. So that concludes our sort of prepared section. And now, yeah, Catherine, if we have time, it'd be great to turn it over to the questions.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Erica, Scott, and Sydney for this incredible, generous sharing of behind the scenes on your work. What we want to do now is we have invited 4 of our partners to pose questions, and we're running a little behind, so I wanted to find out who from the times can stay if we want to go a little past 4 o'clock. Did we lose Erica?
No, Erica's
Oh,
here.
good. Oh, good.
Yeah, I think we're all here. Maybe we
Okay,
go,
good.
I don't know, a couple minutes over.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll try to condense it. First, I want to invite Daniel Zavala from Building Changes to ask his question. So Daniel, please unmute yourself so you can ask.
Sure. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
thanks for the introduction. Thanks for just being here. And I think it's just been great to kind of hear the insight and process that you all approach. One of the things that I've been thinking about actually since a previous convening that many of us were at was around equitable storytelling, right? And I hear you talk about the process you went through, Sydney, in terms of being a conduit, right? You're like, this isn't my story. In many ways, you were channeling Giovanni's story. And I so appreciate kind of hearing a lot of kind of how you've approached that. And in thinking about equitable storytelling, one of the things that I think us as communicators, and I think often we see in reporting, is the lack of a feedback loop, right? If you saying, this is Giovanni's story, what is that feedback loop to ensure that story is still owned by the person who is giving it, right? When I think about whether it's the individual quotes in their individual story, but also data, right? And thinking about the use of data and that data actually being a compilation of individuals, right? So I'd just kind of love to hear from all of you on the Seattle Times team. How are you thinking about the use of data, individual stories, and feedback loops as you approach equitable storytelling?
Yeah, Daniel, I'll just start off. I'm so glad that you asked that question. It's something that I've struggled with because I think that now more than ever there's this reckoning around institutions and institutions like media and whether we do more harm than good. So just for example, with the story with Giovanni, something that I try and do is, one, just full transparency. Oftentimes with sources, especially, sources who are regular people, not politicians or policymakers or anything like that, I'll walk them through what the reporting process looks like, what the fact-checking process looks like, and what they can expect from me. So I made sure Giovanni was kind of updated at every step of the process, what was coming next, what she could expect, what this might mean. And something that I also do is I think it's important, I would never show a story to anyone pre-publication. It's just something that we as journalists don't do, but I read my stories to my sources. So before this was published, Giovanni had heard the story, and it was also part of my fact-checking process. I'll go through and ask like yes or no questions about every single detail in the story about a person so they have the opportunity to correct me. But I think that being really thorough about fact-checking is one way to ensure accountability, and the other is just kind of that harder to define, like reading of the passage back to them, like, does this strike you as right? Does anything about this strike you as off? And honestly, like, yes, factual accuracy is very important, but having a gut check with a source, if you're telling their story and you're telling sensitive parts of their lives, is maybe even more important to me. So I make sure that I kind of build that into the process, again, if I'm telling a particularly sensitive story. And then in terms of equitable storytelling around data and how data is made up of individuals, I think it's really important to speak to the people reflected in the data and ask them what they think it means, because I think showing statistics without context can sometimes be really dehumanizing. So we try to build that in, but obviously, we're flawed, I'm flawed, the team is right now entirely white, which is not great at all. So we have blind spots, we have institutional blind spots that are reinforced. And I think as an individual, the best thing I can do is make sure that my sources feel safe with me to the extent that I can. But I also think that there are some things institutionally that we could change. One of them, and I know this is probably never going to happen, but I personally don't think that we should have a paywall on Project Homeless Stories, just because that means that it's not accessible to the people that we're writing about. So oftentimes after a story is published, I'll find myself delivering papers to my sources, whether they're in an encampment or in a shelter or something like that, just so they're able to see themselves reflected. But I think it's a problem that they aren't able to. Then it makes me ask, who am I actually writing for? So yeah, I think there are things we could do better.
Anybody else want to add to? I feel like Sydney, you did a great job of touching on a lot of things there. Yeah, Scott's shaking his head.
I can't, say it better than that. That was
Erica,
perfect.
from a photo perspective, do you want to add anything? Or?
I really echo what Sydney said when going fact-checking, talking about gut checking to make sure that you have, the ideas about someone's story and making sure that all feels correct to them and framed in the right way. I think with photographs, I think always just asking along the way, what do you think is important to share? What moments should I be at? And then asking check-ins along the way. Does this feel okay? Is it okay if I go in the tent? Is it okay if I'm, this close to you? Is it okay if I'm this close to you? Do you need some time? And respecting community members when, they don't want something photographed, I don't think we have to show everything. So I think it's doing just check-ins periodically through the process and making sure that everyone feels aligned in the storytelling process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney and Erica. Our next question will come from Eric Bronson from the YWCA Seattle King Snohomish. So Eric, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Sydney, again, for writing that piece about Giovanni. I know Janice has been really looking to try and tell the story, the bigger story about how coordinated entry has been biased against Black women in particular. So I know Giovanni was really excited to tell her story. So thanks again for that. I think the question I have is we've all seen over the last 10 years, I think particularly how, I know Scott alluded to this earlier, the opposition to one of the major solutions of homelessness, building more affordable housing, has been grounded in, the opposition has been grounded by those who oppose it, often in very specific details, and details they claim are highly specific to this situation. So we often see that when it comes to, time for a environmental review of a location or design review. And we see these exact same complaints, however, made across our city in every neighborhood, and we're now even seeing them, as I think many of us have learned, nationwide. And so to give a most common example, somehow affordable housing is always out of character with every white neighborhood from Phinney Ridge to Philadelphia. And I guess what I'm interested in is for you as journalists, I understand that, there's a norm within journalism to when folks tell you why they believe something, you take that at face value at first, and at least just trying to accurately represent how they treat that. But how are you balancing how do you plan to inform your readers, not only of the stated opposition to these kinds of projects, but also the clear pattern that exists for these kinds of opposition that kind of undercuts the claims of uniqueness or specificity about these projects?
I could briefly, I don't know if I have a great answer to that question, because it's something that we struggle with a lot. When I started, there was a lot of, actually the very first story I wrote was about the shelter in Bellevue and how the strong opposition was the men's shelter, which to this day, 3 years later, I believe I don't even know if they broke ground on it. There's just been a lot of red tape, and there was a lot of pushback at one of the first proposed locations in Eastgate. Some of you will no doubt remember that. And there was definitely this question of, how much there was this fear that or there was this sort of perception that maybe this was actually going to bleed into Bellevue local council elections. And, I was definitely torn about how much to dig into it because it was also, you just never know with local elections how things are going to turn out. And I think since then, what I've tried to lean on more is showing the commonality, just what you talked about. You, as a reporter, you do hear these same complaints, whether it's the Sobering Center moving to Georgetown, whether it's the Bellevue Shelter, or gosh, I'm trying to think of Compass Broadview, so many different things, Fort Lawton. There always are commonalities. And the trouble is with something like, for instance, the Sobering Center in Georgetown, there were some legitimate issues with the location. So sometimes what people are bringing up is legitimate, and weighing that, however, between the good being the enemy of the best. Do we put this thing here, or wait another year and put it somewhere else that might be the best location? Do we continue to look for the best location? It can definitely, I think the only thing that I can say is that in the last 3 years, I know that we have shifted more away from covering those kind of small neighborhood issues, because we do tend to see the same narrative play out. And I think it's a good question to keep considering in the future, is how do we cover these sometimes neighborhood disputes in the big picture? I wish I had an answer for it. To be honest, so far it's the last year or so, it's been that we don't cover those things as much because we do know how they're going to play out often.
Yeah, just to jump. Oh, sorry.
No. Jump in, Sydney. Go ahead.
No, Anna, you talk.
Okay. I just had like 2 cents to add. So I replaced Scott as the engagement editor on the team. And to answer your question a little more broadly, Eric, I think like looking at the debate around like where to place affordable housing and like those very micro issues maybe in a community. I think sometimes too, like those debates can serve as a metaphor though, right? For like just understanding where people are in their understanding of an issue. So like they're coming at it from their personal interests and needs, but also they're bringing their general, I'm a member of a community and like, here's my quick take on what it means to be homeless, right? Or what it means to be, coming out of homelessness. And so I think some part of our job as well, like to add to Scott, like doing the tit and tat of these like tiny micro back and forth, we could do that forever and continually cover that exhaustively. And I'm not sure how much we would move the narrative forward. So for us, I think it's really important that we serve as like leaders in a conversation. So maybe it's not that like back and forth all the time, but it's how can we just create a general overall understanding and awareness out of our readership, which is a lot of the people who would be in those back and forth debates, right? Like how can we show them the nuance and the little nitty gritty complexity that is this issue, right? And like building a broader, deeper understanding, right? So maybe when they're coming to the debate, they just have a little more nuance and understanding of like the broader picture. Yeah, go ahead, Sydney.
You said it. I'm good.
I was just the one thing I did forget to mention is that big picture, we obviously know that we're not building enough affordable housing and projects for permanent supportive housing. But I would say also that does cut both ways on the big picture, because we've also seen that, I think especially when it comes to tiny house villages, we see that there is less opposition in poorer working class neighborhoods, and so those tend to be the neighborhoods where these projects are cited more often, just from what, and I'm only saying tiny house villages because that's the only one I've actually dug into, but I think if we looked at affordable housing, it's possible that also happens there too. So I think that this can cut both ways, and I do think we can cover the bigger picture in a way that is still balanced, but also, is, is beneficial.
Great.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Emma Scalzo at the Housing Development Consortium, and then if we have time, I hope we do, Jamala wants to ask about solutions journalism in general. So Emma, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so I really appreciate what you all are saying about moving the conversation forward. And I think coming from the housing sector, we all know that it's not as groundbreaking and as, front page news as it seems. We're just kind of moving the conversation and the movement forward. They're not like as groundbreaking as the average news story. So how does that influence the way that you present these issues that dramatically impact housing and homelessness, but so far down the road, it seems? So how do you frame these as, timely and important as of right now?
Yeah, I think it's a little tough, and it's something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around right now. Kind of like Anna said, we're less likely to cover something that is about a specific project unless that project tells a bigger story. So I think with housing, part of what I try to do is, you hear from advocates all the time, like housing, we need more housing. But homelessness is so complex, and sometimes, if you see someone, on the street, in crisis, your immediate thought isn't housing. So I think it's our job to really write about the systemic causes of homelessness, and one of those causes is lack of housing. So I'm finding almost by accident that in all of my stories at some point, no matter what it's about, like someone will say, but really we wouldn't be having to have this conversation if we had more housing, and I always make sure that's part of the story. So I think, reinforcing the lack of housing in talking about the root causes of homelessness is important, but I don't think I'd find myself gravitating towards stories like, hey, here's a new housing development necessarily, unless it was, new in some way or serving a population that hadn't been served by specific housing development before. Yeah.
I don't have anything to add if we want to, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that was...
Thank you, Emma, for asking that question. Jamala, can you please be our cleanup batter and ask your question? Jamala Henderson from the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance.
Hello, everyone. My question basically had to do with solutions journalism, and I'm not sure if that's something that y'all are familiar with. But if you are, I'm wondering what you believe or what you think about solutions journalism in general, and if there is a place for that at the Seattle Times, in specifically looking at more systems and how they're not working for different groups of people or different populations, communities, etc. I was very interested in Sydney's story about Giovanni and how that one change in order to speed things up resulted in something else. And that to me means there's so many more systems that could probably get, really improve based on, daylighting some of the things that aren't working.
We thank you for that question. We have been doing solutions journalism was part of our charge since the beginning. It was kind of written into, we were going to do explanatory journalism, we were going to do watchdog reporting, and we were also going to do solutions journalism, and that was one of the most key things that we could do, because that's what people want to know about, is how do we fix this. So over the years, we've had reporters write about solutions in, like, for instance, San Diego and their car camping program. San Francisco, this was kind of interrogative, but so not so much a solution. But San Francisco had kind of changed the way that they were removing encampments. And we kind of went down there and looked at that and said, is this a solution? I went to Portland and kind of looked at their effort to end family homelessness that also wasn't successful, but then also looking at successful ones. Last year I wrote about how the foster care system, we know that the foster care system fails our young people who leave it. That's it's a well-known fact that when you age out of, well, at least in the system, I think, it's a well-known fact that when you age out of foster care, you are very likely to be homeless and to become homeless in America. And so I looked at a program in Tennessee that has now actually been introduced in Washington as well, that would help young people with housing and kind of getting on their feet when they aged out of foster care. And that program had shown some really great results. So I think solutions journalism is so important in our line of work, writing about homelessness, because people want to know what works. I think the trickiness can sometimes be in the data and the proof, because sometimes it's not completely clear if something works within a year or 2 years. Sydney talked about with this coordinated entry story, a lot of this data was really new. We're going to have to keep checking up sometimes on these so-called solutions and say, did this actually work long term? So I think that's one of the key parts that we have to bring. We have to be. One of my editors once described solutions journalism as it should be as rigorous as an investigative story, but instead of investigating to find the negative, you're investigating to prove the positive. And I think that is very key, that we can't go in with blinders on and say, hey, look, this works, and then find out in 5 years, no, it wasn't actually working.
I also think that solutions are just really good parts of investigative stories. And a great investigative editor once told me that the way he approaches investigative work is to look at how the system should work, look at how the system does work, and then measure the difference between the two. And so I think, in my mind, solutions journalism and investigative work are kind of the same thing, but maybe that's just my personal interpretation. But for example, I wrote about, it was in January, about how people's medical devices are often confiscated by the city of Seattle when they do encampment removals. And it turns out that the city of Seattle, unlike many cities across the country with large unsheltered homeless populations, doesn't have any kind of storage program for people. So they have to cart all their belongings around with them all the time. And this is something that could, in other cities, there are lockers, there are storage spaces that are free. So that was a big part of, once we got through the telling of, hey, this is what's happening, the second part of the story was about, this is what other cities are doing, why doesn't our city have that? So I see solutions as part of investigative work.
And I just want to add a couple cents. So I joined the team in December and still pretty new. I can have the perspective, or, I came in with that citizen's perspective of what solutions mean. And I think from a lot of the emails and comments I get from our readership, often readers can think of a solution as like, it maybe is a Band-Aid, but I think that they're thinking more of like, let's find like the silver bullet, right? Like there's like a code, we haven't cracked it yet or something, like, ooh, it's out there. We just got to like nail it down. And to me, and I think to the team, to come up and understand and like work towards those goals of solutions, we really have to start from a place of how did we get here? And like you were talking about, like unraveling and digging deeper into these complicated webs, right, that led us to this moment. And I just think often with our readership, it's just such an easy jerk reaction, right, to be like, well, what do you do? Like it's just some simple fix or something, or just like throw a little more money at it. But I know at the team, it's not just, right, like looking to the future, but we also have to understand how the hell we got here, right? And so that that's a complicated thing, but I feel like all of that is leading toward something. Okay.
Thanks. I appreciate all of your answers.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to be losing our reporter, so before you need to go, I want to say that one of the really great things about Project Homeless is the fact that you're trying to solicit feedback from readers all the time, whether it's your coffees or the platform that I'm forgetting, you Hearken, to collect reader comments. So the two questions that we didn't have time to get to came from Graham, who wants to know about what the future of reporting on homelessness will be on alternative places to live, such as tiny homes and RVs. And the final question would be from the person who was the very first speaker at the very first Journalism Fellows seminar in April 2010 to try to explain the system of homelessness response in King County, and that was David Wertheimer. And his question was what advice you have for journalists who will be covering the eviction moratorium and the resulting wave of homelessness that will be coming afterwards. Just very horrible to think about. But it's
just one more thing I wanted to add, Catherine.
Sure.
We jump off. So I also was really excited to receive Catherine's invitation for the team to come and join. And I know that Seattle U and Catherine and the project has been an important convener in bringing people together. And in the age of COVID, right, I'm not sure when we will all be able to gather together for another Project Homeless coffee, but just here on this call, I wanted to say out loud and commit to it by saying out loud that the Seattle Times Project Homeless team, I would like to start just a regular coffee hour for folks who work in homeless services, partners doing this work every day, just to offer a chance to come together, and since we can't be in person, at least have a regular opportunity to hear what's on your mind, talk about the news, talk about what we're covering in the news, maybe what we're not covering in the news. So I will work with Catherine, if that's all right, to send out a follow-up email, and I'll get our first coffee date on the calendar. I know we're just having a convening now, so it won't be for another month or so, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Yeah, I really, part of my job is to be a listener and a bridge between the folks doing the work and the work that our team is doing. And so, yeah, so with that and with the project ending, I just kind of wanted to say I want to create an intention forward, right, to continue to come together and listen and share. So yeah, with that, and I'll make sure everyone has my email as well. But yeah, you can contact me at any time. Yeah. And thanks again for having us, Catherine. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate the work that you and your team have done for a long, long time.
Thank you to everybody at the Seattle Times, including the people who were on the original team who couldn't be here today. Thank you to Anna for being the co-organizer of this. Anna, you're incredible. So all of you are. Thank you, everyone. So this will conclude the first part of the convening, the Seattle Times guest speaker portion. And I hope that as many people as possible can stick around for the next 20 to 30 minutes to have our final partner convening. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For your great work. Thank you.
Thank you.